Hitler called it Impregnable. A fortress city, ringed by 18 massive forts and a brick citadel that had stood for almost 100 years. He ordered the garrison to hold it to the last man behind Soviet lines and choke the Red Army's race for the Oder. The men he handed it to thought the walls would save them. They had a deep, dry ditch, 26 feet straight down. They had stone redoubts with firing slits. They had a hill that gave them the high ground over every approach. And in 30 days, the same Soviet army that had bled the Germans white at Stalingrad cracked the whole thing open, fort by fort, room by room, and on the night of the 22nd of February, the fortress that was built to stop them simply surrendered. This is the story of how Vasily Chuikov's 8th Guards Army took apart Festung Posen, the city of Poznan, in a single brutal month of 1945. And it is a story about something the German High Command never really understood. Walls do not win battles. The men who know how to break walls do. Let us go back to the start of it. It is the 12th of January, 1945. Along a frozen line that runs from the Baltic down to the Carpathians, the Red Army opens the Vistula-Oder offensive. This is not a probe. This is the hammer falling. Marshal Chuikov's armies smash out of their bridgeheads on the Vistula River and pour west toward Germany itself. To grasp how fast this came, you have to picture the map the Germans were staring at. For weeks the front had sat almost still along the Vistula, frozen and quiet, while the Soviets stockpiled shells and fuel in the bridgeheads they had clawed out the previous summer at places like Magnushu and Pulovy. Then the dam broke. The opening barrage was a wall of fire, thousands of guns firing together, and the German first line in front of Warsaw was simply pulverized before the infantry even rose to advance. The advance was fast, faster than almost anyone on either side expected. Soviet tank armies were eating up 30-40 miles a day across the snow. Whole German divisions were simply overrun or left behind. The roads west filled with retreating columns that the Soviet spearheads kept catching and cutting. And right in the path of this flood sat the old Prussian city of Poznan. Poznan mattered for one cold, practical reason. Roads and railways, every major route running west from Warsaw toward Berlin passed through it. It was a rail junction, a place where the lines that fed the whole German front knotted together. If the Germans could hold it, they could jam a cork in the bottle and slow the entire Soviet advance toward the Oder, the last great river barrier in front of Berlin. So in the middle of January, Hitler did what he had started doing all across the crumbling East. He declared the city a Festung, a fortress. A Festung order was not a defensive plan. It was a sentence. It meant the garrison was forbidden to retreat. They would be surrounded, cut off, left behind the front line, and ordered to fight on until they were dead or captured. The idea was that a ring of fortress cities, each one a stubborn island deep in the Soviet rear, would tie down enormous numbers of Soviet troops and buy Germany time it no longer had. On paper, it was a way to slow an avalanche by leaving rocks in its path. In practice, it meant abandoning tens of thousands of men and telling them their job was to die slowly. The grim logic had one flaw the maps could not show. A fortress only ties down an attacker if the attacker agrees to stop and besiege it. The fast Soviet tank armies did not stop. They flowed around Poznan and kept racing for the Oder, leaving the city sealed off in their wake. The job of actually reducing it fell to the infantry coming up behind, and that was where Chuikov came in. So who was inside Poznan when the trap closed? Not a crack army. The garrison was a patchwork. There were regular Wehrmacht soldiers, yes, but there were also Luftwaffe ground crews, who had lost their airfields, police units, officer cadets pulled straight out of the local infantry school, and Volkssturm militia, which is to say old men and boys handed rifles and told to hold a fortress. It was the kind of force that looks fine in a headquarters tally and falls apart under a flamethrower. The numbers are still argued over. Estimates of the garrison run anywhere from 15,000 men up to as high as 60,000. The gap is that wide because nobody on the German side was keeping clean records by then. In the end, more than 17,000 of them would be marched off as prisoners. But here is the detail that everyone outside Poznan missed at the time. The real strength of this place was not the men. It was the ground they stood on. To understand what Chuikov's soldiers were about to walk into, you have to understand what the Prussians had built here in the 1800s. Festung Posen was a ring fortress. Around the edge of the city sat 18 massive forts made of brick and earth, spaced at intervals of about 1¼ miles, forming a great circle with a radius of roughly 3 miles. These were not little pillboxes. These were 19th-century engineering monsters, half buried in the earth, so that an attacker saw almost nothing but a low grassy mound until he was right on top of the guns. Each one was surrounded by its own ditch. Each had thick walls of brick and packed earth, sloped and layered to swallow cannon fire and shrug off the artillery of an entire earlier century. The Prussians had laid them out as a system, not as separate strongpoints. The forts were positioned so that the guns of one could sweep the ground in front of its neighbour. Try to crawl up to one fort, and the fort beside it could fire into your flank. It was a web of overlapping fire designed by careful engineers a lifetime before, and it was meant to make a frontal attack on any single fort a death sentence. And then, north of the city centre, on a hill that looked down over everything, stood the heart of it, Fort Winiary. The locals called it the Citadel. The Citadel was the strong point of strong points. It was ringed by a dry ditch about 33 feet wide and 26 feet deep, with the inner face lined in brick so that no man could simply climb it. A ditch like that is a weapon all by itself. Drop a soldier into the bottom of it, and he is trapped on open ground, with steep brick rising above him and nowhere to hide. Behind the ditch rose steep ramparts. Underneath ran multi-story works, tunnels and chambers, a whole hidden world of brick where the garrison could shelter from shell fire and move between firing positions unseen. Built into the walls were redoubts, small armoured strongpoints with firing ports that could sweep the open ground with rifle and machine gun fire. A man standing at the bottom of that ditch under those guns was a man with almost no chance at all. This was the fortress Hitler called Impregnable, and on paper you could see why he believed it. So how do you take a thing like that? The Soviet commander handed the job was Lieutenant General Vasily Chuikov. If you wanted one man on earth who had already proven he could win the worst kind of fight imaginable, it was him. Chuikov commanded the 8th Guards Army. And the 8th Guards Army was not just any formation. It was the old 62nd Army, reborn. The 62nd was the army that had held the rubble of Stalingrad. Street by street, cellar by cellar, against everything the Germans threw at. That history is not just a footnote. It was the reason this army, of all the armies racing across Poland, was the right one for Poznan. At Stalingrad, Chuikov had been the one pinned with his back to the Volga, fighting for single buildings, learning under fire that the way to survive German firepower was to stay so close to the enemy that his artillery and aircraft could not strike without hitting their own men. He called it hugging the enemy. His men had turned grain silos and apartment blocks and a tractor factory into fortresses of their own. Now, the situation was flipped. This time Chuikov's men were the ones on the outside of the walls, and everything they had learned about fighting inside a ruin they were about to use in reverse. These men knew something the defenders of Poznan were about to learn the hard way. They knew how to fight inside a ruin. They had learned it in the worst classroom in human history. Chuikov's force closing on the city numbered around 100,000 Soviet troops, joined by about 5,000 Polish soldiers from the 1st Polish Army. His units included the 28th and 29th Guards Rifle Corps, with divisions like the 27th, the 74th, the 82nd, and the 39th Guards Rifle Divisions. Hard, experienced formations, many of them carrying the Guards title that the Red Army gave only to units that had earned it in blood. The fight opened on the 25th of January, and the first lesson came fast. On the 26th, just one day in, 2 of the southern forts fell, and they fell quickly to the 27th and the 74th Guards Rifle Divisions. That mattered far more than 2 forts on a map. Remember how the Prussians had built the ring as a web, each fort covering its neighbours. Punch a clean hole in one section of that web, and the whole logic collapses. By cracking the southern edge of the ring, the Soviets opened the door into the city itself. And once they were through it, they could pour into the streets and start attacking the inner forts from behind, from the inside, where the Prussian engineers had never expected an enemy to be. Those forts had their heaviest defences facing outward. Their backs were soft. That is the moment the impregnable fortress started to come apart, not at the walls, through them. Now here is where the story becomes something special, because what happened next inside Poznan was not a battle of brute numbers. It was a clinic, a textbook demonstration of how you reduce a fortified city, written by the only men who really knew how. The Red Army did not line up and charge. They broke the city into small bites. The basic tool was the assault group, a storm group. Picture a small team, just a handful of men, but a team that carried everything it needed to kill a building. Submachine gunners to clear rooms, men with the rapid, short-range firepower you want when a fight happens at the distance of a hallway. Assault engineers, the sappers, carrying satchel charges and explosives to blow doors and walls. Flamethrower operators, and behind them, the real muscle. The beauty of the storm group was that it was self-contained. It did not need to call back to some distant headquarters and wait. It had its own riflemen, its own engineers, its own fire support, all moving together, all under one local commander, who could see the target with his own eyes. Each weapon covered the weakness of the others. The submachine gunners protected the sappers while they set their charges. The sappers blew the opening, the riflemen poured through. The flamethrower cleared what neither bullets nor blasts could reach. This was the method Chuikov's army had forged at Stalingrad, refined now into a routine they could run again and again against fort after fort. Because the genius of the Soviet method was that they refused to fight the fortress at long range on the fortress's terms. Instead, they brought the heaviest weapons right up to the front door. Direct fire artillery, dragged forward by hand and aimed straight at a wall over open sights, the gunners looking right down the barrel at the target. Assault guns and tanks rolled up to point-blank range and fired into firing slits and doorways from a few dozen yards away. There is no medieval wall on Earth built to take a tank shell in the face from across the street. The Prussian forts had been designed to defeat artillery falling from a distance, lobbed in high to drop on top of them. They were never built to survive a heavy shell punched flat through the front door at the range of a tennis court. Think about what that meant for the men inside those forts. You are sitting behind brick that has protected soldiers for generations. The walls around you were built by men who had calculated exactly how much pounding they could take. And then a Soviet self-propelled gun noses around the corner and puts a shell straight through your gun port. And all that careful 19th-century mathematics counts for nothing. Let me put one of these forts in front of you. A Soviet assault group works its way up to it under covering fire, the riflemen and gunners keeping the defenders' heads down so the engineers can move. The direct fire artillery hammers the entrance, blowing in doors and collapsing the openings. The sappers rush in close and pack explosive charges against the walls and the doors, and the blast tears a way in or buries a firing position under its own rubble. The flamethrower team sends a roaring tongue of fire through a firing slit, and the air inside turns to an oven, sucking the breathable air out of the chambers behind the wall. Any gun that keeps shooting gets its firing port jammed, sometimes literally stuffed with rubble and debris thrown in by furious Soviet infantry so the weapon inside cannot aim at anything anymore. There is something almost crude about it, a soldier ramming broken brick into a gun slit by hand, but it silenced strong points that shells had failed to crack. Fort by fort, the ring went silent. By the 12th of February it was almost over. Most of the city had fallen. The garrison that had been spread across 18 forts and an entire city was now squeezed back into one last place, the hill, the Citadel, Fort Winiary. And inside that Citadel, the German command had changed hands in a way that tells you everything about how desperate this had become. Back on the 28th of January, just 3 days into the assault, the original fortress commander, General Major Ernst Mattern, was relieved. The outer ring was already cracking, the southern forts were gone, and the men above him wanted someone who would not bend. In Mattern's place came a different kind of officer, General Major Ernst Gonell, a fanatical Nazi who believed in holding to the last man not as a tactic, but as a faith. Where Mattern was a soldier doing a hopeless job, Gonell was a true believer who saw the hopelessness as the point. Gonell imposed brutal discipline on the garrison. There would be no surrender, no retreat, no weakness. Because for a man like Gonell, the order to die in place was not a burden. It was the whole reason to be there. So the men trapped in Poznan were caught between two fires. In front of them, the most experienced fortress-cracking army in the world, grinding closer street by street. Behind them, a commander who would shoot them sooner than let them give up. There was no good direction to face. If you are enjoying this breakdown of how the Red Army took apart one of Hitler's fortress cities, take 1 second to subscribe. It genuinely helps the channel, and there is a lot more Eastern Front coming. The hill was the last act, and it was the hardest. When the final assault on the Citadel opened on the 18th of February, the Soviet soldiers came up against that ditch, 33 feet across, 26 feet down, a brick face on the far side too steep to climb. And above it, the Vouts with their firing slits waiting. Every fort in the outer ring had eventually fallen, but they had all sat at ground level. This was different. This was a moat on a hilltop, the single hardest nut in the entire fortress, saved for last because there was no way around it. What happened next looked less like 1945, and more like a siege from 500 years earlier, because to get men across that ditch, the Red Army went back to the oldest tool in the book. Ladders. Soviet infantry hauled scaling ladders down into the dry ditch and tried to climb the far wall, and as they did, the redoubts opened up and swept the ditch with fire. Men fell back. The first rushes were thrown back bloody. For all the tanks and the flamethrowers and the modern firepower, the Citadel had forced the battle back to medieval terms. Men on ladders against men on a wall, and the wall was winning. So the Soviets did what they had done to every other fort in the ring. They stopped trying to climb the problem and started trying to destroy it. The redoubts had to be killed one at a time, and it took the better part of 3 days. This was the slow, grinding heart of the whole battle, fought not in miles but in yards. One redoubt was burned out, silenced with flamethrowers and explosives poured in until nothing inside could keep fighting. The second one had its line of fire physically blocked. Soviet troops, sick of being shot at, hauled rubble and debris and jammed it in front of the firing ports until the guns inside could no longer see the ditch to shoot into it. Crude, brutal, and it worked. A redoubt that cannot see cannot kill, and a redoubt that has been set on fire from the inside stops firing for good. Then the engineers solved the ditch itself. The sappers built an assault bridge across that deep dry moat, a span strong enough to carry armor. Think about what that took, under fire on a hilltop, with the defenders shooting at every man who showed himself. The engineers had to work in that killing ground, the very ditch where infantry had been cut down on ladders, and lay a structure tough enough to hold the weight of a tank. And early on the morning of the 22nd of February, Red Army tanks and assault guns rolled across it and out onto the main grounds of the Citadel. The high ground that was supposed to be untakeable now had Soviet armor standing on top of it, guns swinging toward the inner works. The single greatest obstacle in Festung Posen had been beaten not by climbing it, but by bridging it. For the men inside it was finished, and they knew it. Gonell, the fanatic who had sworn there would be no surrender, gave his surviving men permission to try to break out and escape. There is a bitter irony in that. The man who had forbidden every form of retreat finally opened the door to one, but only when there was no door left worth opening. It was far too late, there was nowhere left to run, and the ring around the hill was closed. Gonell himself would not be taken alive. He shot himself in the head, by some accounts lying on a Reich war flag, choosing the death he had demanded of everyone else, and asking nothing of himself that he had not asked of every old man and boy in that garrison. And with Gonell gone, command of the remaining Germans fell back to the man it had been taken from, General Major Mattern. The same officer, relieved almost a month earlier, now had one decision left to make, and unlike Gonell, he made the human one. During the evening of the 22nd of February, Mattern surrendered the remaining roughly 12,000 defenders to Chuikov's forces. The Citadel garrison's surrender was carried to Chuikov that night by Major General Bakhanov, of the 74th Guards Rifle Division, one of the very divisions that had cracked the southern forts on the first day. There is a neat symmetry in that. The division that opened the battle at the southern wall was the one that took the final word of surrender at the very end. By the 23rd, the fortress was fully cleared. Hitler's impregnable fortress had lasted about 30 days. None of this came cheap, and it would be a lie to pretend otherwise. Soviet losses in taking the city ran somewhere between roughly 4,800 and 6,000 men killed, plus about 700 Polish dead. Every fort that went silent, every redoubt burned out on that hill, was paid for in Soviet lives. On the German side, over 5,000 of the fallen were buried at the Milostowo cemetery, and the city itself paid a terrible price for being declared a fortress. The fighting wrecked it. Around 55% of Poznan was severely damaged, and in the historic centre the figure climbed as high as 60%. A Festung order does not just kill soldiers. It grinds the city under them to powder, because every street becomes a battlefield, and every building becomes a target. But step back and look at what actually happened here, because it is the whole point. Hitler believed in walls. He believed that if you built the stone high enough and ordered enough men to die behind it, you could stop an army by sheer stubbornness. The Prussian forts of Poznan were some of the strongest